Hey guys, Coach Eric here, and just want to talk about the notes for the virtual days and go over some information that is important for your test and for learning this unit on World War One. And last time we talked, we discussed the two fronts that were part of World War One. And you had the Western Front that consisted of France, Belgium, and Germany, and a lot of fighting going on there. And then the Eastern Front that bordered Germany, Russia, and Austria. So you know that Russia or Germany is going to be fighting on two fronts. Well, that all happened because the Sleepland plan here failed. The plan to quickly conquer France before Russia could really join the war failed. It did look like it was going to work, but it failed. There was massive shelling along the front lines there. 8 days straight of shelling along the front lines um, as Germany moved through Belgium and quickly into France. And 8 days of shelling with 3,000 guns. And the outcome, massive destruction, but not a victory. And that's what kind of changed the wars because um, although it looked like a major German victory was happening, it changed quickly. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. There was a battle before this plan really failed, and that is the Battle of Tannenberg. The Battle of Tannenberg was an interesting battle to say the least because it really changed the perspective of Russia, for instance. So Russian forces had launched an attack in both Austria and Germany, and at the end of August of 1914, Germany counterattacked here. So this battle lasted about 7 days, and it was between Germany and here's your layout. The Germans had 166,000 troops, and the Russians had 206,000 casualties. 12,000 for the Germans and 150,000 for the Russians. And you can obviously see that Russia should win, but they're not going to. During the 7-day battle, the Germans crushed the invading Russian army and drove it into full retreat. Um, Russia fared somewhat better against the Austrians, but they really just struggled overall. Uh, their war effort was just lacking. Their industrialization was lacking. A couple things that led to is that Russia's army never entered German lands again over the course of the war, and Germans proved that they were a strong enough army that they could defeat larger opponents. And I'm going to try not to ramble on and on in this video for Macy and Gage's sake, because they sometimes talk about me rambling and going on and on. But that's the Battle of Tannenberg in a nutshell. Is that the Russians were really just outmaneuvered, out flanked by the German fighting force. Their army was just better equipped, more prepared, and more ready for those battles. And so that happened very early on, and it really set the tone because now Russia is on the retreat, and Germany can really focus on the Western Front. That was the Eastern Front. The Battle of Tannenberg really starts the Eastern Front. Now we're going to turn our eyes to the Western Front, and you have the First Battle of the Marne. Uh, on September 5th through 12th, 1914, about 30 miles northeast of Paris. This is after basically the German forces had swept into France and reached the outskirts of Paris. The Allies regrouped and attacked the Germans northeast of Paris in the valley of the Marne River. Every available soldier was hurled into the struggle. So you have basically the French and the British versus the Germans. The French and the British had 1 million troops versus the Germans 1.4 million. So obviously you could think that the Germans are going to win, and it would make sense. But you had 263,000 casualties on the Allies side, and the Germans had 220,000 casualties. So again, it looks like they're going to win. But when reinforcements were needed, more than 600 taxi cabs rushed soldiers from Paris to the front lines. After 4 days of fighting, the German generals gave the order to retreat. And it was probably the most important battle of the war. because it set up some things. One, Paris was safe from Germany. Two, Germans retreated and dug trenches. Start of trench warfare. What we're working on projects in class about. This would last basically the entirety of the war. The Schlieffen Plan was completely abandoned at this point because a quick victory in the West was no longer possible. And like I said, the Russians were bearing down on the Germans in the East. And the Germans sent thousands of troops from France to aid the forces in the East, and the Western Front eventually becomes a stalemate. And that's kind of the big thing. The First Battle of the Marne basically leads to the stalemate of the Western Front. Sorry, Macy. One of the other major battles, and it's important for us because it's one of the bloodiest battles of World War I, and we're going to look at some other ones in class, but was the Battle of the Somme. This was, one of the roughest, dirtiest battles that we could definitely talk about, and we'll get some understanding of it here. The battles between France and Great Britain versus the Germans. Troops size 1 million to 1.4 million. 623,000 casualties versus 500,000 casualties. Again, who do you think wins it? No real winner. An interesting point because really, that many people die. You have not a lot of true winners. Why did some consider this battle a failure? Well, a couple of reasons. One, Great Britain bombarded Germany with over 1.6 million shells for 8 straight days. I don't think you can imagine the amount of shelling that is. We saw some artillery shells and the piles and piles of artillery shells in the weapons of World War I gallery walk notes from last week. I don't think that we can really do it justice to really see the amount of damage that really takes place during this time. But the significance of it is, just so much shelling. But Germany knew and they took shelter. So like all this bombardment really didn't do anything. So the French and the Great Britain onslaught, the bombardment just really didn't do anything to affect them. The British soldiers then marched into no man's land. This is what we've talked about with trench warfare. They marched in thinking that the Germans had been taken down, and over 60,000 soldiers were gunned down almost instantly. It's the single worst day in casualties in British military history. You kind of can't imagine the amount of just death that does take place there. And that's something that it's hard to understand. It's hard to get a real meaning to that amount of people. That's half of a football stadium in Alabama. Some of the outcomes: the Allies gained 7 miles of territory after 2 years of stalemate. And look how long this battle was, from July 1st to November 18th. That's months. 6 months, roughly. July, August, September, October, November. 5 months. Almost half a year, and they gained 7 miles of territory after 2 years of stalemate. The slaughter just it's hard to imagine. And I'm rambling, sorry, Macy. But each side just lost so many men, and it really wasn't worth that much. It did relieve pressure on French troops as the battle of Verdun that had also seen each side lose more than 300,000 men. But there's just so much death in this war, and that's kind of one of the main staples, of World War I is so much death. But those are some of the battles of World War One. We're gonna talk about some other things in the second video, and so make sure you pay attention to those ideas, and make sure you get your notes as you do. Make sure you do your discussion board post about just some of the interestingness of these three battles, and um, make sure I'm. Yes. And just make sure that you keep adding to your notes as we go on. You'll need these for your test that is coming up March 12th and uh, March the 16th. So make sure you have that information there. If you have any questions, send me an email. And otherwise, have a great day.